Good morning. I'd like you to think about your last class. So that might have been intermediate microeconomics on Thursday afternoon, or principles of macro on Wednesday morning. Might have been the online class you checked in on this morning. Might be the online class you're checking in right now, some of you. That's okay. But think about the learning outcome, the content, the topic, the model that you're using. Everybody got it? Now, what I want you to do is change your thinking a little bit and think about the ethical questions that rise from this content, from this model. Now, you may call them normative questions, but I think normal people in the real world would call them ethical questions. They are questions of right and wrong and good and bad. So think about those questions for a second. And now talk to your neighbors, talk to the people at your table about what are the ethical questions that come up in a typical class. So it sounds like most of you did not have trouble coming up with ethical content in your classes. And so the next question is, what did you do about those ethical questions? Now, I think this is a big question, a big problem. We've talked a little bit about yesterday. Betsy and Madhavi both talked about how ethics kind of is pervading the stuff we're doing in a principles of economics class. And there's lots of evidence that studying economics reduces some behaviors, attitudes, changes the way students think about certain ethical questions. And so I think it's a good time for us to think about this, especially at a place like today. So I've been encouraged to see how often this comes up. Now, I've had the privilege the last couple of years of working on a project that's supported by the Daniels Fund, looking at ethics in an engineering school. So I teach at the Colorado School of Mines, which is mostly students studying engineering, and thinking about integrating ethics education into not only broadly across the curriculum, but in specific courses. I've talked to lots of faculty about why they don't specifically deal with ethics in their instruction. And kind of the top 4 reasons shouldn't come as a surprise to you. But I want to give you a method that might help you integrate more ethics into your courses without and address some of these problems. So I'm going to borrow a technique from engineering ethics, and it's called Micro-Insertion. So Micro-Insertion is these small chunks of ethics instruction that is dropped into our regular course content. And this Micro-Insertion method was developed by a moral philosopher at the Illinois Institute of Technology, of all places, named Michael Davis. And Davis's goal was to make ethics, professional ethics education in an engineering curriculum pervasive without sacrificing the technical content. And Davis proposed a couple of ways of doing this. And one of them is to change the context of what we're teaching to highlight the ethical questions. And the other is just to add an additional question to an assignment that you're already doing. So I'll give you a couple of examples of how I've implemented this in my one-semester principles course. This is my last class. So my last class, we were talking about international trade, and Alex and I were talking about this yesterday, that President Trump has been a gift for teaching about international trade. So we should count our blessings where we can. And this is a statement from then candidate Trump about his views of international trade. He's been very consistent. He said the same thing back in the 80s about Japan. And I have my students that use the supply and demand model to kind of dig into the economic logic of this. And they're really good at figuring out there's winners and there's losers. And to get them to identify the logic that Mr. Trump is using is that he is concerned, when he talks about losing, he talks about the loss of producer surplus. And the students can talk about that, identify the winners and losers. And I used to just stop there. But there's another question that we can ask that I think students are already thinking about, and that's just the simple question of, should we care about the losers? Students are very interested in talking about this question. They're very engaged in this question. And we can have them discuss this for a few minutes, maybe talk about what we could do to help the losers and what are the costs and benefits of those policies. But we should be explicit about the fact that not just that there are winners and losers and stop, but there's some ethical question here. Should we help the losers? Should we, like Mr. Trump, care about these losers? Another example is near and dear to the hearts of my students. Again, I'm in an engineering school, and so this notion that technological change affects labor markets differently for different kinds of workers is pretty obvious to them. My students are the winners in this. So when I ask them to identify labor market or technological change that affects labor markets and causes a decrease in demand, they the same things that your students probably come up with. Automation, self-driving trucks, kiosks at restaurants. And the flip side for my students is each of those things are increasing the demand for labor for my students, for engineers, for mathematicians, for computer scientists. And so follow this up with a question, again, about should they care? Should the winners in this, should the people whose demand, see the demand for their labor increase, should they care about the people who've experienced the opposite effect? And I haven't done this yet, but I think I'm going to change this language, a suggestion from some other people, to talk about whether the workers who are worse off because of technological change deserve some kind of assistance from people who win in this process. That makes it even, it's not just do I care, but do they deserve this? So thinking about the ethical question at least at a different moral level. Easily to do something like this in a macro class. I teach the one semester principles course, so I think I use this exact same slide for a century, and give the current data from about the labor market and ask students to calculate the unemployment rate. Is there an ethical component to this calculation, to this definition of unemployment? You recognize it, I recognize it, our students recognize it, but I don't think we always talk about this. So you can just add a little question afterward. What do we learn about what matters and what doesn't matter from this particular definition of unemployment, from the headline number that when we talk about unemployment? And it's not just what kind of unemployment matters, what kind of unemployed people matter. This is an ethical question. And our students recognize at some level that we're skating over these big ethical, these big normative questions. And I think, again, like Betsy and Justin have been talking about, we lose credibility with our students when we ignore these things, when we slight them, when we don't think about them, when we send our students out to use economics in a world that is full of ethical questions, but we're not willing to address those kind of ethical questions on our own. So those are all examples of adding a little question. I have more examples of these, and if you're interested, I'm more than happy to talk to you about this. But Davis also recommends changing the context of a question, changing a context of a question that highlights some of these ethical issues. And so this is kind of a standard approach to teaching pollution policy. You have your two firms with different marginal costs of abatement. Students to find the socially optimal level of abatement, calculate the cost of a command and control system versus a tax versus a cap and trade system, figure out who's going to buy permits, who's going to sell. And my students are really good at doing that, and they think this is interesting. Oh, this gives them the logic of a cap and trade system. But it's a little dry, right? Why should I care about firm A versus firm B? So we've been recontextualizing this question to think about two countries instead of two firms. So Germany is the high marginal cost of abatement. Bangladesh has the low marginal cost of abatement. Put students in the context of a climate negotiation. Now all of a sudden we've got people, not these firms, right? I mean, we can give the names to firms, but that doesn't affect as much as this is a decision about the Germans. Should the Germans be able to outsource their pollution abatement to Bangladesh? When Bangladesh does more pollution abatement and Germany does less, that may be efficient, but is that fair? And then Michael Sandel's been writing about these issues of turning more and more of our society into market transactions. You can bring in some of that little moral theory, and Sandel's got a great TED talk on this, and have students do an offline or an online discussion about this. This kind of highlights these ethical issues. Okay, Now, our friends from Mob Lab are outside, some of them in the room, and so any of you played this Mob Lab game where students have to make a choice between a dirty factory and a clean factory? I recommend, if you haven't ever used Mob Lab, they're very generous about letting you check these things out. And I was experimenting with this experiment the other day, and students choose either a dirty factory or a clean factory. They choose a dirty factory of lower cost of production, higher profits. Choose the clean factory of lower profits, but the dirty factory creates pollution, which creates healthcare costs, which are very explicitly defined, and how that contributes to the net profits of the firms. And like you would expect, most students choose the dirty factory because it has higher profits. And it's easy to unpack this and talk to students about, well, why did you choose dirty all the time? Or why did you choose clean? It seems like you get higher profits if you choose dirty. You can identify easily the market failure here, right? More students choose dirty factories than is optimal, and you can just stop there and move on. It's a very clean little experience. But I get to teach engineers, and so again, Michael Davis developed this technique to deal with professional ethics for engineering students. So I asked students, oh, you're a mechanical engineer? Is your behavior consistent with the code of ethics that you adopt as a mechanical engineer? Well, I don't know. I'm not a mechanical engineer yet. Should they be thinking about the profession that they're going to be entering? I think so. Well, the first fundamental canon of the Code of Ethics of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers is that engineers shall hold paramount the safety, health, welfare of the public. Did your decision consistent with holding the health, safety, and welfare of the public paramount in your decisions? So we bring this home to students in not just a right, wrong, general, moral, ethical question, but a professional ethical question that makes it much more concrete. The downside of this is that they always ask me, what's the code of ethics for economists? That's the topic of another talk. And so, again, why don't we teach ethics? I hope this method of micro-insertion helps you think a little bit about dealing with especially the opportunity cost problem, and I don't know how to integrate ethics into my classes problem. But we're still left with the problem of not being any of you moral philosophers? No. And whether or not this works, how do I assess it? And so, again, I'm not a moral philosopher either, so I'll rely on a moral philosopher, again, Michael Davis, who's identified these 4 ways that we can assess the effectiveness of our ethics education. And I think the first 3 we can assess pretty easily in the classroom. The 4th one requires us to observe our students making decisions with ethical consequences in the real world, so we'll ignore that one for a moment. I think you can assess ethical judgment, and researchers have done this by looking at things like the dictator game. Are they making a decision that's consistent with their values? I think it'd be pretty straightforward to test students' ethical knowledge by doing a test or a writing assignment that assesses their knowledge of ethical theory. It would be easy if I knew enough about ethical theory to write that test. So I kind of do the low-hanging fruit. I focus on ethical sensitivity. It doesn't require me to be a moral philosopher. All I have to do is care about the ethical questions that come up every day in my classroom. And we've done some work on this. My colleague Becky Lefrancois and I have been trying to assess ethical sensitivity among our students, and unfortunately, consistent with some of the literature that Betsy talked about yesterday, our students become less ethically sensitive over the course of the semester. Okay? And so we had an opportunity to do a little controlled experiment. We saw our measure of ethical sensitivity decline by 40% between the pre-test and the post-test. I'm a little embarrassed to put that giant red arrow up there. The good news is that when I did a few micro-insertions for the ethical stuff, I asked questions about the ethical content. In the treatment group, the decline was only 24%. Only 24%. So I don't think I made students more ethical, but at least staunched the bleeding a little bit. And again, baby steps are important. So if you're thinking about doing using this technique, I have a little advice for you. And so the first thing is, don't worry that you're not an expert in ethics. All you really need to do to get students to increase their ethical sensitivity is to care about these issues, raise them. Students are more than willing to talk about this. And I haven't found students requiring me to have the answers to these ethical questions. Second thing is to start small. We did 4 of these micro-insertions in the semester where we had some measurable effect on students' ethical sensitivity. So it's easy to just drop these in a few times and then build on what you're already doing. It's easy to just take what you're doing, adapt it a little bit with an extra question, and then don't make the mistake that our students do all the time and focus only on the costs. I want you to think about the benefits of helping students learn to use the economics that you're teaching them for good. Thanks.